but I'm fine, hence the Band-Aid. So, as I said earlier, I just want to reintroduce Bruce Bullock. And Bruce, thanks for everything that you have done to further the cause of energy rationality at SMU and the work that you've done with the Bush Institute. So I think there's still some people outside, but let's get started. Bruce?
Thank you. And I want to thank the Bush Institute for having me here today. I want to thank Jim Glassman for all of his support, and Amity Shales as well for her invite to chair this. Our panel today is the future of coal regulation. And I kind of think Diana's book title, Regulating to Disaster, might be a more appropriate subtitle for this particular panel, as it turns out. But we've got a really distinguished panel here this morning. We've got with us a coal producer, a coal consumer, and a financier. And our hope over the next hour is to talk about the issues with current coal regulation, the direction the federal government appears to be headed, what the economic impacts of that are upon our economy, and really what we think can be done, if anything, to shape that regulation more constructively in the future. I'd like to first introduce our panelists. To my immediate left here, we have Joe Kraft, who is President, Chief Executive Officer of Alliance Resource Partners, which is one of the nation's leading coal companies and the coal industry's first publicly traded master limited partnership. Next to him is Ray McCormick, who is Managing Director of Headwaters Investment Bank and someone with a great deal of experience in the mineral industry and the financing thereof. Then we have Mac McFarland, who's President of Luminant Energy here in Dallas, which is Texas's largest generator of energy and the operator of some significant coal-fired power plants in this state. And then we have Andrew Morris, who is the Jones Chairholder of Law at the University of Alabama, and in the Alabama Law School, his scholarship is focused on regulatory issues, property rights, and energy. I'm going to dive right into some questions. First of all, coal has for nearly 100 years played a very, very large role in the U.S. economy and the energy mix. It generates between 30 and 40% of the electricity in the United States. It's a significant employer. And I'm going to turn to Ray first and have him make the case for coal. It's under fire at the federal government. It's not, at least in the public eye, the most favored source of energy right now. Make the case for coal for us.
Thank you, Bruce. And I also like to thank the Bush Institute for asking me for the panel to participate in the panel and talk a little bit about the state of the coal industry today. Bruce, the case for coal is strong. America has always benefited from cheap energy. It really cuts through all the cost and all the products and services in the United States. It makes us strong and competitive in world markets. And coal has been vital to that for many decades. Basically, coal generation has been fundamental to the way the nation produces electricity, and it's essential for the U.S. economy. 40% of the electricity generated in the United States is coal-fired. Coal also advances domestic energy security and drives the economic growth. The U.S. has the largest fossil fuels in the world, and we must do a better job in tapping those fossil fuel resources. And of that, coal is America's most abundant fossil fuel, making up about 92% on a BTU basis. So if we look at coal, we have over 230 years worth of reserves based upon our 1 billion ton a year production rate. The United States has 30% of the reserves in the world. We're the largest reserve owner in the world. It's an abundant, reliable, and affordable fuel. Generation costs are 50% lower in states that rely predominantly on coal. and 20 of the 25 states that have the lowest electricity cost predominantly use coal. So if you're a person living in California, which has 8% of their generation fired by coal, you're going to pay twice the amount for your electricity versus a person living in the state of Kentucky with 92% of your generation fired by coal. So obviously, you know, the manufacturing facilities are going to want to locate in those states that have the lowest electricity cost. Coal produces cheap baseload power and generates it efficiently. Our U.S. coal fleet is about 1,300 plants and produces about 300 gigawatts. We have over $1 trillion in our coal fleet in the United States. Now, under worst case scenarios, based upon some of the EPA promulgations and laws, if we look out over the 10 years or so, shutdowns could possibly be up to 375 units or 54 gigawatts. Now, that's 20% of the U.S.'s coal fleet, and that would impact 38 states. And of those states, Ohio and Pennsylvania would be hit the hardest. And just a comment, coal is being burned cleanly. You know, if we go back to the 70s, we've actually tripled the coal use in the United States since the 70s, and there's been a 40% decline in emissions. If we look at one of the largest consumers of coal, Southern Company, they're planning a major shutdown of their coal fleet, pretty significant shutdown. And Southern Company and some other outside firms have done some studies, and they're showing that the power in the Southeast could increase, power costs could increase by like 25%, and it could impact 250,000 to 500,000 jobs. So the United Mine Workers also has put out some studies that the direct and indirect loss of jobs could be 250,000. So besides the 13 gigawatts of coal-fired power that's either permitted or under construction now, there's been no new coal-fired plants announced. So just to talk a little bit about coal and the impact to the economy, coal use provides about 800,000 jobs in the United States. Labor income is about $50 billion. And the coal industry jobs are high paying. They're generally twice what general industry salaries are. The direct and indirect contribution to GDP is about $90 billion. So there's a substantial impact to the economy in the coal industry. As we all know, alternative fuels are heavily subsidized, and you know, with the federal government having a $17 trillion debt, just don't know if we can afford that, quite frankly. The loan guarantee program that's in place now for alternative fuels has exposed the taxpayer to $10.4 billion for 19 projects. And of those 19 projects, 12 have declared bankruptcy, and the remaining few, quite a few, are distressed. So alternative energy, and I think we'll get into this more in the panel, but has some really major issues. It can't be dispatched by utilities. There's intermittent power generation issues. As you know, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. We have economical energy storage dilemma. There's scale issues. As you know, you can put a 1,000 megawatt power plant or a 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant on a site, but with regard to wind and solar, much smaller scale. And, you know, unsubsidized solar is many times more expensive than coal-fired power. So the U.S. does not have a coherent energy plan, and we're not setting any benchmarks. We really don't know where we are. And it really should be guided by free enterprise and the free markets. And market-friendly energy will make it possible for faster economic growth and support jobs throughout the whole economy. So without reforms and the proper policy, the United States is going to be facing a world of higher energy costs, and it will make us less competitive in the world markets.
We have an opportunity to export coal right now, but those kind of exports require access to capital markets to grow for our coal companies. How has this regulatory environment that we're seeing affected our coal companies' access to capital markets?
Yeah, I think the United States has a opportunity to triple their current exports. That's assuming we can get some permits permitted in the United States. But the war on coal has been exceedingly difficult for coal companies, especially the independent coal companies, to attract funding to themselves. It's a very capital-intensive industry. If you look at the The top dozen or so publicly traded companies, they have a CapEx budget of about $6 billion a year. Some of that's funded internally, of course, but there is a lot of demand for capital. They're attempting to reduce their CapEx for this year by about 20% in 2013, so they're very cautious about that. But there's been 7 notable credit downgrades in the coal industry since 2011. And coal equities were down about 46%, and they were the worst equity performance sector over the last couple of years. So that's basically closed the coal industry off to the public markets, public equity markets. There have been several U.S. and foreign commercial banks that have instituted a policy of not lending to the coal industry anymore. So that has certainly hurt as well. Personally, I lent to the coal industry in the decade of the 80s, and when I was doing that, there were about 30 U.S. banks that had formal technical mining departments that were lending specifically to coal, and now there's about a half a dozen U.S. banks that are doing that. So some of the major coal companies have been forced to the high yield market. There were about 3 major transactions that were done at the end of 2012 that totaled about $1.4 billion, and that's very expensive. They're paying interest rates of about 10%. So it's a very high hurdle for them. I would say now that the coal industry is basically just hunkering down. They're managing their capital, they're reducing their CapEx, they're trying to control costs through operational efficiencies and productivity improvements. They're rationalizing production, trying to maximize cash flow, trying to delever themselves from internal generated funds, looking strongly at asset sales, and trying to maximize the value of their asset base. Now, internationally, the United States, with their current climate action plan, has pledged that they, through the U.S. Import-Export Bank, will not fund any more coal projects in the world. And the first casualty of that was a new coal-fired plant in Vietnam, which did not get funded. So, and then following the lead of the U.S. Import-Export Bank is the World Bank and European Investment Bank. And combined over the last 5 years, they invested about $10 billion around the world funding new coal plants in various countries. So they are also going to not, they're going to pledge not to provide capital to foreign countries. So the result of that, the supply of cheap electricity to poor nations will be much more difficult, and it'll be difficult for them to increase their standard of living, and will hurt their ability to urbanize and industrialize. So, and I think China intends to take advantage of this international funding gap by exporting their coal plant technology and having Chinese banks provide some of this capital. So in general, it's been very difficult for the industry as a whole to remain financially sound with the existing policies. And for example, there are no investment grade rated coal companies. So it's been very difficult in the industry.
I'm going to turn now to Andrew and get you to talk a little bit about the case that's being made against coal. If you look at the legislative and regulatory initiatives that are out there, one would have you believe, they would have you believe that we're trading up. You've got green energy, other sources of energy are friendlier from an environmental standpoint and possibly from an economic standpoint. But has the critical analysis and examination really been done in that regard?
Not at all. As you would expect, I didn't bring a copy of the book to show, but as the co-author of a book called The False Promise of Green Energy, I would say no. At the beginning, Ambassador Glassman mentioned President Bush's early campaign speech in which he said, you know, we set the rules and we have a playing field and then we let things compete. We're doing the exact opposite in green energy. We are politically deciding which technology and which companies get funding rather than letting the market decide. And as a result, people who have no skin in the game are allocating resources. And they're allocating resources to technologies that are unproven and often don't work very well, and which raise serious questions about reliability in terms of our electric grid and so forth. We often hear about the Chinese solar industry as a model, and I think that is the model for some people. They want a centrally directed industrial strategy that picks a technology, which is what China has. What the green energy subsidy people can't answer, and I've asked this question a dozen times to them, is just how long are we going to be borrowing money from my children to pay for your thing? Just give me a date. we don't have to stop it today, but I want to know what day you're ready to compete on a level playing field with other technologies. And they never can answer that question because it's always 5 years in the future.
Can you talk, we had in the previous panel, a little bit of difference of opinion on the role that cost-benefit analysis should play in the regulatory process. Could you make a few comments on that, give us your views on that?
Sure. I mean, cost-benefit analysis isn't a panacea, but it would be nice if we knew whether the federal government was getting a consistent return on its efforts in different areas. So when the federal government does cost-benefit analysis, the results are often embarrassing. So when the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 were passed, Congress mandated that there be a cost-benefit analysis of the Clean Air Act done. And that was found and this was done under the Clinton administration, so it wasn't done by some crazy industrialist. Found that almost all the benefits of the Clean Air Act came from one or two regulations with respect to each criteria pollutant. So the question is, what are the other several hundred regulations about each criteria pollutant doing? Well, if they're only yielding 20% of the benefit, maybe we're not getting our money's worth. So I think it's a very good way to benchmark government activity. But the real cost-benefit analysis comes from financiers going out and evaluating projects and saying, you can't pay me back if you do that, so I'm not going to give you the money. That's the cost-benefit, the market test cost-benefit analysis is what we really need.
Joe, I want to turn to you now. Your company's posted 12 consecutive years of record financial results. As you sit down and read the tea leaves of this regulatory environment, how do you plan with this kind of regulatory environment to continue that kind of growth and those kind of results?
Thank you for inviting me. First, I want to extend my appreciation to the Bush Institute for putting a spotlight on these issues, because it is critical for our nation. You heard some of the sadness that Ray talked about for our industry. We're sort of an outlier. We have grown, and our stock's grown 30% plus this year, and we've done it by making investments and growing our production. I believe that coal can continue to be a low-cost source of electricity in this country, and contrary to all the issues that we have, coal's not going to go away. But these policies that we're discussing today have, in fact, put a lid on our growth. Notwithstanding, we're still going to need it, and we're still going to need low-cost fuel. So we as a company have focused on investing in low-cost reserves so that we can be a competitor in a stagnant growth business. But we've been able to do that and grow. But what I'd rather talk to you today about is not really about the coal industry in particular, but really what it's doing to our economy and the future of our country. I think it's aspirational to have a 4% GDP growth target. This country needs that to deal with the debt issue that we have. Unfortunately, with the energy policies that are being advanced today, we're not going to get there. If you go back in my career, I started in the 70s as a product of the energy crisis. And at that time, with the Arab embargo, we saw energy cost almost double to increase about 4 times in a very short period of time. It was tremendously disruptive to our economy. We saw double-digit interest rates, we saw double-digit unemployment rates, and it was an amazing reckoning for our country to say, what are we going to do? So there was a focus where low-cost energy had been taken advantage of for this country to get on an economic path that we were on to grow our economy. So the federal government did provide some leadership to say we've got to turn back to coal at that time, and nuclear. So the federal government went to coal and nuclear to wean the country of oil at that time, and some natural gas. They had a Fuel Use Act of natural gas that prevented natural gas being used in the power plants. So for since the 1970s, the country has embraced low-cost energy, low-cost fuel as the number one driver, the economic backbone for the growth of this country. And it hasn't been until the last 5.5 years that we're seeing a government that's trying to adopt a high-cost energy strategy versus a low-cost energy strategy. If you look at economic growth and you track GDP, you're going to track coal production almost 1-to-1 up until about 5 years ago. So a steady growth in GDP. Ray talked about how we've tripled our production in that time period. Steady growth in GDP, steady growth in coal production. In order to grow your economy, you have to use energy. Coal got its place, 40 to 50% of the electricity generation, because it is the lowest cost fuel. We are now being challenged by trying to raise our cost of fuel. In order to take our market share, we have seen government policy to try to do nothing but really raise our cost of coal production and or generation of fuel. So when you look at the regulation, it impacts both production and impacts consumption. As we think in terms of the consumption, that's where the greatest impact has been. You heard Diana talk earlier about the MATS rule. That's the most expensive regulation that this country has ever seen. That is going to come home to roost by 2015 when the compliance date will be implemented. So as we look at the regulations on consumptions, we've seen hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars being invested by electric utilities across this country trying to meet these independent regulations, individual regulations that are independent of each other with no coherent strategy. We've got 29 states in the United States of America that depend on coal more than any other fuel to generate their electricity. This is going to result in double-digit increases in electricity that's going to impact the consumers, both individuals that are on fixed income, the poor, as well as the commercial sector for services rendered, as well as the manufacturers, which will impact jobs throughout the economy. As you think about these regulations, what I think is amazing and critical, all these regulations are directed to laws that were passed in the 1970s. There's one exception to that, and that was the Clean Air Act of 1990. So all these laws have had regulations on the books for many years, and they've worked well. Up until 5 years ago, the policy was one of wanting to have safe coal mines, clean water, clean air, same time allowing us to be competitive in a world economy. They wanted us and understood the importance of low-cost energy. Now we're on a new paradigm focused on high-cost energy. The only thing that saved our economy, in my view, is the shale revelation that we heard earlier today. Because the federal government hasn't regulated the shale oil and gas, our economy continues to be sputtering along at 2%. And I can't imagine what it would be without that. So as we think forward, the regs that are in place today that the utilities are dealing with will, in fact, cause 20% of our capacity to be closed or shut down. As we look at that as an investor, we say, okay, even with 20%, there's still a billion-ton market. So coal production in the United States reached its peak in 2008 at 1.2 billion plus. Today, there are some people projecting we're going to be slightly under a billion. As we look at the regulations as they impact, even with 20% decrease in the number of coal-fired power plants, we believe that we will sustain a 950 to 1 billion ton industry. That will be because of the utility plants that remain. They are operating at lower capacity, and we believe it will still be the lowest cost fuel, and that will allow for higher efficient or higher capacity or higher utilization of those power plants. So that's focused on the regulations that are in effect today. You heard earlier the headlines dealing with the greenhouse gas rules and the expected regulation that's going to be proposed by the Obama administration in the next week, which will effectively mean that there will be no new coal-fired power plants. That is a huge issue for diversity for our country. It's a huge issue when we think of reliability for our grid and our ability to have electricity on demand like we're so used to. The bigger issue, because I think most coal producers in particular, and I'll let Max speak to the utility side, but most coal producers like me, I mean, I've assumed that we aren't going to have a new coal-fired power plant in the future anyway. So I'm designing my investments around a billion-ton industry. The real issue is going to be what do they do with existing plants. That rule and regulation is being mandated by the president to come out in June or July of 2014. That's going to be the real issue that's going to determine the fate of our economic future and our ability to have low-cost energy in this country.
Well, thank you. Mac, a lot's been said here about the importance that coal plays in the electric market. We can't go out and turn off 40% of the lights right now.
We could. We're not going to.
That's right. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of coal here in Texas, number one? And number two, tell us a little bit, I don't think it's well appreciated how far coal has come in terms of its environmental record.
Yeah, and I think that gets lost when we wake up every morning to a news story like the Journal this morning about carbon regulation. Admittedly, it's a trying time for the coal industry and coal-fired electric generation for two reasons, right? We have a changing environmental landscape that's ever-changing, and I'll come back to that, and that's what this panel's here to talk about. But it's also being challenged by low natural gas prices and the displacement of coal-fired electricity by natural gas. And brief comment on that, which is, I think Secretary Evans hit on it, that this institute is about freedom, and I think freedom starts with capital markets and democracy. And capital markets means free markets. And so my view on things, even as a coal producer and a coal consumer, is that if we're going to be displaced by natural gas, so be it, in a free market. But let's have a good playing field by which to compete, which is the key word. We want to compete as a coal industry on a level playing field with good regulation. Not no regulation, just good regulation. So that brings me to the second point, the ever-changing regulatory landscape. I think we've mentioned several of the rules that are out there in front of us. MATS, which has been passed and we're in the process of complying with. The new rules on carbon that are coming up for new plants as well as existing plants. But how did we get to where we are today? And where is coal today, I think, is an important sort of set point. If you look, we mentioned the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Since that time frame, because it set achievable goals with respect to sulfur dioxides, nitrous oxides, the criteria pollutants, particulate matter, and it had an achievable timeline, the industry's come a long way. We emit far less SO2 and NOx. The percentages are huge, 60, 70, 80% reduction since 1990 of those criteria pollutants. We adapted. The coal industry adapted. The coal-fired electric generation industry adapted. They were reasonable limits, and they were achievable timelines. And so I think the Clean Air Act and the way that those rules were promulgated, the amendments of 90, is instructive today. We made the investments. The issue is that we are a very capital-intensive industry. These are billions of dollars, okay? So let's fast forward. We've cleaned up the air. We're enjoying cleaner air than we've ever enjoyed in the past 30 years, and yet we continue to evolve environmental regulations. We'll adapt to those, but they need to be achievable. We need to be able to compete, and they need to have a reasonable timeline for implementation. So Diana mentioned the MATS rule, and I would like to address the cost-benefit analysis of the MATS rule in just a second. And the MATS stands for Mercury and Air Toxic Standards Rule, the Mercury rule. It deals with mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants. When we meet that rule that's gone in place, we will have reduced 90% of the mercury emissions from coal plants across this country, okay, from that 40% electricity production. So it had a reasonable timeline. It had achievable limits in MATS. Now, we disagree fundamentally, perhaps, with some of the underpinnings of the rule itself, because as Diana mentioned, it wasn't about mercury, even though it's called the Mercury rule. And the cost-benefit analysis, just as a couple data points on that rule, mercury was about a $6 million benefit out of the $35 billion annual benefit. So the other 34 point whatever, I can't do the decimal places right now, was all associated with particulate matter, even though there's other rules associated with particulate matter. And the rule was also supposed to only cost $6 to $9 billion per year to implement. It's costing far more than that, and we're not getting a mercury benefit out of the rule. Put that aside, it still fit within the Clean Air Act, and it had achievable limits and achievable timelines. And so I think it's instructive today that when we look at how far we've come because we've had that type of paradigm in the past, where we had something that fit within the Clean Air Act and was achievable. As we look forward today with the announcement of the carbon regs that are coming out on new power plants, and next year in July 2014 for existing power plants, I hope that those regulations will fit that same paradigm. And I hope that once we get to whatever regulation comes out of there, that we have a sustainable period, which is another important point. If you look at rules, environmental rules on the coal industry, when they were done and they set in place for 10 years, we could make the capital investment because we knew what the standards we had to achieve were. But when you get another bite at that apple every 3 years, you just decimate capital investment, which takes away from jobs, takes away from economic growth, and takes away the hope for the 4% growth that this institute's looking for.
Very good. I think one of the things that clearly has occurred is the efforts in this regard have shifted from the legislative in the legislative arena to the regulatory arena. Cap and trade initiative failed in the Congress earlier in this administration, and now the focus is clearly by regulatory fiat at the EPA. Oil industry has gone through this throughout its life in trying to make the public more aware of it as an industry and the economic contribution that it makes. As it was mentioned in the earlier panel, it went out and formed ANGA and so forth. Any advice for the coal industry going forward and how we can get the public more involved in this debate? And Joe, I'll start with you.
Well, we've attempted to do that. Unfortunately, it's hard to get a little airtime with the way the world turns these days. But we have attempted with various programs. We're continuing to reevaluate that and determine how we can best communicate that message because we've tried in different angles. And I think we've got to get back to a message of it's about the people. We care about the middle class. We care about the working poor. We care about those that are going to be so desperately impacted by high electricity costs. We've got to educate the public on the importance of low-cost energy and how it multiplies through the economy. If you don't, most goods that are made include a cost of electricity in making that product. And as you roll that through the cost of the product, it's just going to impact everyone. As Max said, we're continuing to do it on a cleaner and cleaner basis. The issue's back to climate. Are we going to have a debate about climate in this country? Is the fact that we haven't had warming over the last 16 years, is that relevant? Is the fact that the models that we're predicting all this doom and gloom as far as our climate, the fact that these models aren't predictive of what we're actually seeing, are we going to have a debate about that? And are we going to continue to understand the importance to our economy? We've seen in Germany, in particular, that Karen brought up, who did focus on wind. They've gone back and looked at studies as an example and showed from a carbon footprint, carbon emissions standpoint, there is no difference between wind and coal when you take in the life cycle of both products. So can we have that debate and can we have that discussion to where, as Max said, we've got a level playing field where we can, in fact, talk about it with looking for a solution instead of an ideological perspective.
Mac, can you comment a little bit about that? I mean, once you get in the regulatory process, and you too, Andy, because we've almost confined it now to the regulatory process and the legal process. It's either in court or in the regulatory process. How do we get it out of there and back into the public eye?
Well, I think we need a conversation about what the rule of law means in this country. So if we're going to shift regulatory activity from things that people can be held politically accountable for. So when Congress passed the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, the people who voted for it, the people who voted against it, can be held accountable by the voters for the consequences of that legislation. When EPA issues a regulation, there are no political consequences for that, because the president can say, oh, well, that's an agency, that wasn't me, and Congress say, well, I'll help you fix it. If you give me enough contributions, I will go and we'll tinker around the edges here. So actually, it's in Congress's interest to make these vague statements of we all want everything, and agency go get it for us. And then, so what's happened over time, I think, is the agencies have switched from the model you talked about. Here's our clearly stated goal. We've had a debate about what we want the goal to be. This is the goal. We're going to give you some stability so you can invest money in the knowledge you will get a return on that investment, to a sort of arbitrary kind of, I'd like to get a promotion, so I'm going to try to get the biggest fine ever so that my boss will then recognize me. And we've seen that over and over with EPA. So I think we need to talk about the fundamental importance to capital markets and to the business community of having the rule of law in this area, not just be a matter of political fiat.
I think we need to get the debate from just environmental rules. We need to broaden the debate. So, for example, when we start talking about environmental regulations, it's a focus on what should that environmental regulation be. That's one factor, right? The American economy, $15 trillion a year economy, needs to be the biggest factor, okay? We need to take that into consideration. So I know the governor in the previous, from North Dakota, said, his views on cost benefit, but I think that's one of the biggest factors we need to raise the debate on. If we look going forward, it's about jobs, the economy, and how these environmental laws protect human health and the environment within that context, okay? We can't sacrifice, we can't be the environmental elite nation at the sacrifice of our economy. That's just not going to work. So there is some risks that are appropriate. They need to be factored in, but the economy, jobs, and the economic impact of laws need to be factored in there as well.
We've got just a few minutes here before questions and answer. I'm just going to go down the line here. Much was said earlier about the role that states play. How can the states help in this process right now? We've got people from various areas of the country, and Ray, let's start with you. You've recently relocated from Pennsylvania to here, so you've got a broad look at this.
Yeah, I think, for example, from a funding, providing capital to the extractive industries, we look at a lot of factors. And for example, we were doing a financing in the state of Utah, and Utah's been one of the best state regulatory environments, rated by Forbes for several years in a row. So that obviously is, a factor that we consider. Although I would say from a permitting standpoint, that entity had to take, it can take up to 5 years to have a mine permitted in the United States today. And you're going to get challenges all along the way. And in this particular case, it actually went to the Utah State Supreme Court, and it was a unanimous verdict, 9-0. So anyhow, there's just so much uncertainty, and we have agencies that are off the reservation, and there's too much uncertainty, so it creates very difficult conditions for the capital markets to apply capital to the industry to fuel the growth.
Joe, you operate in many states.
I think it's critical for the states to provide the leadership. I think if you look at the federal government in this area, we've had a Department of Energy. I go back to early 1980s when Don Hodel was Secretary of Energy, and he recommended abandoning it, closing it down, because they didn't have a say. And ever since then, they haven't had a say on energy policy. So at the federal level, we don't have an interest in trying to bring together a federal policy on energy. We've seen in the states where the states are focused on the issues that Mac talked about, that I think is critical for our country to grow. And you look at natural gas as a perfect example. And I want to congratulate the oil and gas industry and for the shale revolution, because without that, our country would be in dire straits. I think we need to embrace that. And I can't imagine, you heard Karen talk about there's 13 federal regulations right now trying to figure out how they can go back to the Clean Water Act of the 70s and find some standing to regulate fracking when it was obvious that when that law was written, nobody knew fracking existed. So there's constant attempts from the federal level to try to stop you from doing things as opposed to trying to help you be successful. And I think with this shale revolution, we're at a point in time for our country to where we can have energy independence. And I think it's so critical today as we see what's happening in Syria. And you go through this museum and you look at the last 12 years with 9/11 that we just celebrated, and the Iraq War, and the focus on national security with the Middle East, how critical it is to have an independent basis, independent security for energy. And we need all of the above to make that happen.
Mac?
We
How can
only
the states
operate,
help?
we only operate in one state, and I think my lucky stars, it's Texas every morning. So, look, I think the issues that we're discussing when it comes to federal laws associated with clean air are cross-border, and so it becomes very difficult. Our state is very pro-business, very low regulation, good working relationships with the state Center for Environmental Quality, and they can work with the federal EPA. But I think it's a broader issue that has to be dealt with in D.C. because these rules were set up to be nationwide. I think how our states interact is basically through our elected officials in D.C. and holding the regulatory process accountable for making sure that we have practical rules, that they don't have economic harm, and that they fit within the context of the laws of the land, which happens to be the Clean Air Act. And so it's holding people accountable to that.
At the same time, I mean, we in Texas, as you know, we had a perfectly good, efficient air operating permit process up until 2010, until the EPA decided to come in and try to grab it. And so I think the role that the states can play, obviously, is critical in trying to help keep the process moving forward and keeping the EPA at least reluctant to do that from time to time.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you're speaking about the carbon permits for new plants in the state of Texas, which is when the EPA issues a rule, the state has an opportunity to implement its plan underneath that rule, and then the EPA judges whether or not that rule fits within the context of the federal rule. And state of Texas decided not to accept the greenhouse gas permitting of new power plants back in 2010. Recent legislation in Austin has changed that, and now the TCEQ has the authority to grant that permit. But in the lieu of the TCEQ having that ability, we basically sat with open permits for years. We didn't have any applications, but I know other applications for new power plants, industrial sites, basically sat because there wasn't a standard even at the federal level for what a greenhouse gas standard needed to be for a new site, and it sat there. But now the TCEQ has taken that over after this recent legislative session, so hopefully we'll move on.
So that's good news.
That is good news.
Andrew?
I think there's two things. First is I think Governor Perry is a good example of somebody who's played a constructive role by going to other states and saying, bring your business to Texas because we have more sensible regulation. So the states need to compete with each other, and they need to be aggressive about it, and that helps hold elected officials elsewhere accountable to explain why the Texas governor is running around the state gathering up businesses and carting them back to Texas. The other is that state elected officials need to hold their congressional delegations accountable and rein in this steady increase in federal control over environmental stuff. The Clean Air Act was originally written by Senator Muskie, who is a former governor, who created a very large role for the states in it because he was cognizant of the importance of state-level regulation. And over time, it's been a steady ratchet up in the federal share of that as the EPA bureaucracy continues to look at these benighted people in Texas who aren't regulating enough and says, oh, we need to pull more of that in. So the only way that's going to be stopped is by states participating in court cases, and the states have done that, and they need to be holding their state congressional delegations accountable to hold EPA accountable.
Well, I think at this point we'll go to questions if anybody has them out there. If not, then we can. I've got a couple more up here. We've got a couple more minutes left on the panel, but I think we've got one over here.
Yeah, thanks very much. My question is for Mr. Kraft. I'm an investor in this particular industry, and after this very sobering discussion today, would like to know the kinds of things you're doing specifically to increase the value of your firm by 30% in the midst of all this.
Well, we've invested about $1.5 billion over the last 5 years. We've got 2 coal mines that we're currently constructing. We've got a growth plan that we're producing 40 million tons a year. We've got a growth plan that'll take us to 60 million tons in 2020. We're basically benefiting for the tons that are not being produced in the central Appalachia area that you heard Governor Corbett talk about in eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia. So we've seen 100 million tons of production come out of central Appalachia that's moving towards the area that we've invested in, which is the Illinois Basin and northern App. So we've positioned ourselves over the last 20 years to acquire low-cost reserves that were high in sulfur, but with the investments the utilities have made to remove the sulfur, about 99% of it, the utilities have made the investments through scrubbers that will allow them to burn our coal cleanly, so we're producing a very low-cost fuel relative to central Appalachia. And that's how we're able to compete and how we're able to grow. We haven't focused too much on the export market that Ray talked about, but that's another option for us that we've got our eye on. Because we're a master limited partnership, we've relied on long-term contracts with utilities, and we've been very fortunate to be able to build relationships with the utilities that have the embedded investment with the scrubber technology that allows our coal to be burned in an economic way, but still allow us to have opportunity to grow production, and that's how we've been able to grow our company, is through growing up production more than the price of the product. After 2020, we'll see.
We've got one back up there or over here. Go right ahead.
If I heard correctly, we've got about 1,300 coal-producing plants right now, and about 375 might be shut down. For my edification, roughly how many windmills or solar panels or nuclear power plants would it take to replace 375 producing plants?
375,000, give or take, at about a mega. So, if it's 375 per coal plant, we have a 1,000 megawatt coal plant. It takes 1,000 times that, so 1 million windmills at 1 megawatt apiece. And then you get into this is the point that was made in the last panel about how many windmills can you put on acreage, and you expand and expand and expand from that. That's too many decimal, scientific notation for me to do in the head, but a lot, millions.
Well, I understand in Spain that they said they went really big to wind power a number of years ago. And first of all, they said it's ruined the beauty of our country. Before, you'd come around a bend, you see a beautiful mountain. Now you see a bunch of windmills everywhere. And they said that for every one job created in the green energy, it destroyed 2.5 jobs in the regular economy, going to alternative energy. So, plus it's heavily subsidized.
There's a book that goes through the scale, and it will give you the math on that. It's called Power Hungry. by Robert Bryce, who's head of the Manhattan Institute. And so it goes in detail about the applicability of the various power sources and what the scale issues are, and why relying on renewables is not a reasonable alternative for us to consider as a replacement for fossil fuels in this country.
You also need to build natural gas plants for when the wind's not blowing.
Right.
So it's not just the wind.
It evaluates all those predicaments.
One fun fact on that, City of Austin, to power them, and they get a good portion of their power. They have a municipal power agency, but they get a good portion of their power from the South Texas Nuclear Project. You would have to cover the state of Rhode Island with windmills in order to power the City of Austin. So that's directly out of the Power Hungry book that Joe's referring to. I think we've got a question up there, and then we'll wrap it up.
This question is for Mr. McFarland. The numbers that the EPA is floating around this morning of 1,100 pounds of carbon dioxide emission per megawatt, how many of your existing power plants would be able to even comply with that standard if it was imposed?
Well, that rule's for new, which I'm sure you're aware, but so just a couple numbers, which is a new gas plant emits roughly 1,000 to 1,100 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour of production. Coal plants range a little bit, but are generally around the 2,000 pounds to 2,200 pounds per megawatt hour. And so to try to achieve an 1,100 pound limit, I think that's why the subtitle says novel, right? Because it's just, there's a term in the Clean Air Act about adequately demonstrated emission control technologies. And currently, there are no large-scale, adequately demonstrated control technologies for carbon dioxide. So you're asking a question that has the practical reality today. It isn't a practical reality. But that, I should emphasize a point, which means we should continue to invest and continue to do the research to try to make carbon capture and sequestration, which is how we would try to achieve those limits, a reality. We've made some investments. There are several plants being constructed today that are looking at doing that. It's just very, very costly. And so it's not economical, but we should continue to do the research to try to achieve that standard.
I think the last question goes to Jim Glassman. There we go.
Okay, so actually, your main competition is not windmills, it's natural gas. And so could you just, any of you, just make the argument for coal versus natural gas?
Yeah, I'll take that question. Yeah. You know, if you look out at the NYMEX for next year, over the next year, gas is going to be at about $4, a projection for the course of the year. So at $4, coal can more than compete with gas. If you take the Powder River Basin can compete at $2.50 to $3.75 gas. The Illinois Basin can compete at $3.50. Where you run into problems is in Appalachia. There they need about $4.50 or so or above. But where natural gas is going to be priced probably going forward, coal can compete with natural gas. Even at $3.60, I mean, what we see in the Illinois Basin right now is people going from gas to coal. Coal lost about 100 million tons last year, and it'll probably gain 50 of that back. So we see switching the other way right now, from gas to coal in the Illinois Basin.
Can I just add to that? The other argument for coal has been that your price has been more stable than that of natural gas.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And you feel that's going to be true going forward as well?
Yes. In fact, there's even been some decline in coal prices across the country. And it's, you know, the utilities have always been concerned about, you know, what natural gas prices are going to be going forward to commit $1 billion for a new plant, and, you know, and have no real certainty with what the price of natural gas is going to be during the 30 or 40 year life of that plant. whereas coal is very stable on a BTU basis, cents per million BTU.
I would add that, and I live in Tulsa and I speak at a lot of panels with natural gas producers. Most of them tell me that, gas needs to be $5 before they really want to commit drilling capacity to natural gas, especially now with the shale plays for oil and liquids that yield a higher profit for them. So you've got that aspect to consider as well, and as far as future gas prices. And another aspect is we've now got 4 LNG terminals that have been approved, and if you look at the world price of natural gas, it's in double digits. So you may have an opportunity to see natural gas being exported at a higher price than what they can get here in the United States.
Right, so we're going to have an export panel, which I'm going to moderate after lunch, and so you coal folks are definitely in favor of more exports of natural gas, right?
We want low-cost energy for this country.
Right.
We're for free markets.
You're
For free markets, right. I agree with what Mac.
Good. Well, stick around for that panel. So one last question, Bruce, if I may, which is about exports. Okay, so what is holding up exports of coal? There are other countries that don't have the onerous rules that we do. They're begging for coal, so why don't we just export more of it?
As Ray said, we did set a record last year, 125 million tons. About half of that was metallurgical coal for the steel mills, half of it was steam coal. So when you look at why we're down a little bit right now is because of the contraction in the world economy. We're starting to see a pickup in that in China again for steel making. So we do believe next year we're going to see met coal go back to the 57 million ton type level for export. Metallurgical coal is in scarcer scarcer reserves of met coal around the world. So I think there is opportunity for the United States to export metallurgical coal. On the steam coal side, we have been a swing supplier, and that's because most of the export market is dependent upon Central Appalachia, which the costs are higher, and a lot of that's been driven by federal regulations. We are starting to see the lower cost, higher sulfur coal penetrate the export market, and as I mentioned earlier, we're evaluating that. And so I think that as you see other countries like Indonesia, there's projections that by 2020, Indonesia will not have sufficient coal to export into Asia. So that's a longer term game. I don't think we're going to see it in the short term for steam coal, but I do believe in the 2025, 2030 timeframe, as you look at other producing regions of the world, that the U.S. coal will in fact be a factor in supplying the world with the low-cost steam coal.
China, I was just going to say China announced recently that they were going to build 350 new coal-fired power plants. So if you look at China and you look at India, there's tremendous thermal coal seaborne trade that they're going to require. And the United States has a capability of tripling their existing coal exports, but we're going to need the ports to do that. And in the Pacific Northwest, there's been real issues about trying to get permits to build new ports to export coal. So hopefully that gets done.
I know Bruce is trying to wrap the panel.
No, I was going to add.
What he's supposed to do. So that's good. Somebody kept asking questions and prevented you from doing it.
Please join me in thanking the panel for their remarks today.
It's been a great panel, and thank you, Bruce. And so the only reason I'm up here is just to say we have a 15-minute break, and then we'll reconvene in this room for another plenary session. So thank you again.